I'm going to tell you about a man who got removed from a room by security while wearing a wine-stained jacket, and how that single moment erased 6 years of careful invisibility. If you want to see what happens when someone finally stops pretending to be smaller than they actually are, you need to watch this through to the end. But first, if stories about patience, dignity, and the cost of underestimation matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Marcus Webb had spent the better part of a decade learning the architecture of restraint. Not the kind that comes from weakness, but the kind that requires actual strength. The ability to hold something valuable close without needing anyone else to see it. He understood that the most powerful people in any room were often the ones nobody was watching, and he had built a life around that principle deliberately. The private investment fund he ran through layers of corporate protection was worth more than most people could calculate in their lifetime. It had been his father's legacy, expanded during his own careful stewardship, diversified across sectors that ranged from renewable energy to infrastructure. The number was closer to $900 million, a figure that existed in spreadsheets and board documents that only a handful of people had ever actually seen. But Marcus didn't spend his time in ballrooms or penthouse dining rooms talking about that number. He spent most of his time in work boots, in conference rooms with executives who didn't know who was actually signing the checks, and in conversation with people who had no reason to flatter him. He had learned long ago that this was the only honest way to move through the world. 7 years before the incident that would change everything, Marcus had been engaged to a woman named Claire. They had planned their lives together with the kind of certainty that comes from believing you've found someone who loves you exactly as you are. He didn't think of himself as a cautious person in those days. He was young enough to believe that love was simpler than it turned out to be. When a real estate project he had quietly backed fell apart in a matter of weeks, he watched the consequences ripple out faster than he could have anticipated. The losses were manageable from a financial perspective. The loss was different. Claire had moved out without explanation, without even the courtesy of a goodbye that required them to be in the same room. She left a note on the kitchen table that said very little except that she couldn't be with someone who was failing. He spent months after that trying to understand what exactly had changed between them. What had shifted so dramatically that someone who claimed to love him could vanish that completely. Eventually, he stopped trying to understand and just accepted what he had learned. People behave very differently when they think you have lost everything, and the only real way to know how someone actually sees you is to give them a reason to believe you have nothing left at all. That lesson had cost him a lot. It had also taught him something valuable about how to move through the rest of his life. He met Natasha Chen at a nonprofit fundraiser in the downtown district, the kind of event where people gathered to talk about their commitment to community, while actually networking with people whose names appeared in professional publications. She was standing near the silent auction table examining a piece of art with the focused attention of someone who actually cared about what she was looking at rather than performing interest for the benefit of people standing nearby. When he asked her about it, she didn't immediately shift into the mode of friendly conversation that people typically adopted with strangers. She looked mildly annoyed that someone had interrupted her evaluation of a painting she'd been considering. He thought that was refreshing. They talked for almost 3 hours that evening, moving from the art to broader questions about whether nonprofit fundraising actually addressed problems or just made wealthy people feel less guilty. She was sharp enough to push back on his opinions without agreeing with him automatically. She was interesting in a way that suggested she had developed opinions about things because she actually cared, not because she was testing out how well certain ideas would land with different audiences. When he asked for her number, she didn't play games about calling him back. She texted him the next morning with a specific time and location for coffee. Their first date was intentionally unremarkable. Coffee at a place that didn't try too hard. Conversation that moved easily from topic to topic without needing to be steered. He remembered thinking that this was the first time in years he had been able to just exist with someone, without calculating what she was observing about him, without wondering if this version of himself would be enough to keep someone from leaving when circumstances changed. For the first 3 years of their marriage, he was convinced he had made the correct choice. Natasha was someone he could actually be himself around, or at least he believed that at the time. She didn't need to know about the fund, or the holdings, or the family estate that existed in a completely different world from the shared apartment they had rented together. She didn't need to know, because what mattered to him was simply that she had chosen him without any of that information coloring her decision. He wanted to believe that what they had was enough. But somewhere around the middle of the 3rd year, he began to notice changes that were small enough to explain away individually, but substantial enough to create a pattern he couldn't ignore. Natasha started coming home later than usual. Her phone became something she carried with a specific kind of attention that didn't match her usual behavior. The conversations they had became shorter, not hostile exactly, but distant, in a way that suggested someone was already moving emotionally away from a space they were still physically occupying. Marcus didn't ask many questions. He told himself he was being patient. He told himself this was a temporary phase in a marriage, a period that would pass like other periods had passed. What he was actually doing was waiting for his wife to decide whether she wanted to stay, and he was doing that waiting in complete silence, without ever forcing her to articulate what was happening. The man's name was Harrison Price. He arrived at Natasha's company as a senior consultant in early spring, and within weeks he had established himself as the kind of person who knew everyone, who had interesting stories about travels to interesting places, who seemed to operate at a level of success and confidence that made ordinary professional achievement look small by comparison. He wore the kind of clothes that announced he had money, without requiring him to mention it. He referenced his second residence in the mountains the way other people mentioned weekend plans. He had a talent for making whatever he was saying sound important, and whatever the person he was talking to was interested in, sound like a legitimate area of inquiry worth his attention. Marcus noticed the way Natasha began to orbit around this person. He noticed it because he was waiting to notice it. He was waiting for the moment when the version of his wife who had laughed at his jokes would be replaced by someone who seemed to be performing a different version of happiness, one that was more polished and less genuine than anything he had ever witnessed her create before. He waited and observed and said nothing, because part of him needed to understand exactly what was happening before he decided how to respond to any of it. The certainty came on a Wednesday evening when Natasha left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to answer the door for a delivery. He wasn't searching for anything. He was simply standing there when the screen illuminated with a message from a contact, saved only as H. The preview contained enough information to tell him everything he needed to know about how long this had been developing and how intentional it had become. He set the phone back down in exactly the position it had been in before. When Natasha returned to the kitchen, he asked if she wanted tea. She said no. Marcus spent the following days in a state of clarity that felt almost like numbness. He contacted his attorney, James Foster, who had handled his financial matters for over a decade. James was the kind of lawyer who didn't require extensive explanation when something serious needed to be investigated. He said he would have information within a week, and he kept that promise. What James discovered was a pattern of financial irregularities within Harrison's division. Vendor payments that didn't correspond to any actual contracts. Budget allocations that had been approved at one figure and dispersed at a substantially different amount, with the discrepancies routed through shell companies that seemed to exist solely to move money around. Harrison Price wasn't just a charismatic consultant. He was systematically stealing from the company with the confidence of someone who had never believed anyone would look closely enough to notice. James wanted to move immediately with this information. He laid out the case for presenting the findings to the board within days, for allowing the internal investigation process to take over, for treating this as a straightforward case of fraud that needed to be handled through proper channels. Marcus told him to wait. He told him he needed the complete picture before anything was presented to anyone, that he needed every transaction documented, and every thread pulled before this situation was put in front of the people who could actually take action on it. What he didn't tell James, what he barely admitted to himself, was that he was also waiting to see what Natasha was going to do. He already knew she would make the wrong choice. What he needed was to live inside that knowledge for a while, before he decided how to respond to it. He needed to understand exactly what kind of person she had become before he made any decisions about what came next. For the next 6 weeks, Marcus moved through his life like someone performing normalcy. He went to work. He came home. He ordered dinner or made simple meals that neither of them ate with any real interest. He watched his wife occupy the space they shared, like someone who had already mentally moved to somewhere else. He observed all of it without comment or confrontation, because he needed the full picture before he acted. The crisis came at the Meridian Hotel's annual Benefactors Gala, an event that Natasha's company had been contracted to help organize. It was exactly the kind of venue and crowd that Harrison would want to be seen in, exactly the kind of room where confidence could be mistaken for authority, where the right suit and the right stories could make someone seem more substantial than they actually were. Marcus arrived in a dark charcoal suit that didn't announce anything about him. He positioned himself near the perimeter of the ballroom, close enough to observe what was happening, and far enough from the center to avoid being drawn into conversations he didn't want to have. He watched Harrison work the room with practiced ease, moving from group to group, making people feel like they were the most interesting person he had encountered all evening. He watched Natasha stay close to him, animated in a way she hadn't been in months, laughing more freely than she had in their apartment in longer than he could actually recall. When he moved toward them, it wasn't to confront anything or to make a scene. He simply wanted to be present, to see what would happen when he inserted himself into the space that his wife and this man had been occupying together. The moment Natasha turned to face him, he understood that he had already been erased from her mental picture of how this evening was supposed to unfold. Her voice was low, but pitched to carry to the tables around them. She asked him what he was doing over here, suggested that he didn't really fit with this crowd, implied with a tone that made the words sting in a way that pure language shouldn't have been able to accomplish. Harrison glanced at him sideways and said nothing. He didn't need to. The dismissal in his silence said everything it was designed to communicate. Two colleagues who had witnessed the exchange suddenly developed intense interest in things that didn't matter. One of them stared at the floor. Another smiled into his drink with the particular expression of someone who was entertained but didn't want to be caught being entertained. Marcus took a step back and returned to his position against the wall. He understood that there was nothing to gain from responding, and he knew it. Margaret Cho, who chaired the board of the company, had been scheduled to give remarks at 9 o'clock. She was speaking quietly with two other board members when Natasha crossed the room and approached the microphone without any announcement or permission. The room shifted the way rooms do when something breaks the established order of things. People turned. Conversations trailed away. Natasha tapped the microphone once and delivered her announcement with the confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She said that her marriage was over. She said it looking directly at Marcus across the room, performing his humiliation for everyone watching. She extended her hand toward Harrison, and he crossed the floor to stand beside her, with the ease of a man who had been expecting this exact moment, who had been waiting for the signal that would allow him to step fully into the position he had been maneuvering toward all along. She told the room that Marcus had no ambition, no future, and didn't belong in a space where actual achievement was being celebrated. She said it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the words multiple times, who had prepared this statement specifically for this audience. Then she nodded toward the security team, and they began moving in Marcus's direction. He looked at the nearest guard and set down his glass, then walked toward the exit without looking back. He was 12 steps from the door when Margaret's voice cut through the room with absolute clarity. She said his name. She told him to stop. The room went completely quiet. Margaret Cho had been chair of this board for almost a decade. She was a woman who had built and sold two separate companies before joining this one. She was the only person in the building who understood the complete structure of the investment fund that Marcus controlled, and she had honored his confidentiality without question for 7 years. She stepped to the microphone. She looked directly at the gathered crowd and began to speak with the calm authority of someone who doesn't need amplification to be heard, but uses the microphone anyway, because the moment demands precision. She explained that the company had survived its 3rd year because of a capital commitment made by a private investment fund when no other institutional backer was willing to take the risk. That fund had never asked for recognition or a seat at the table. It had asked only that its involvement remain confidential, and that request had been honored. The investment had been the difference between the company failing and the company eventually thriving enough to become the successful enterprise that everyone in this room was celebrating. Margaret looked directly at Marcus. She said that Callaway Capital, the fund everyone in the financial world knew about but nobody could quite connect to an actual person, had just been humiliated by the woman who had benefited from its support, in front of the very people who knew how significant its role had been. The understanding moved through the crowd like a visible wave. Faces shifted as people recalibrated what they thought they were seeing. Natasha's expression drained of confidence in stages, like something that had seemed solid was suddenly revealed to be built on a foundation that didn't actually exist. Harrison's face got harder to read, but his jaw tightened and his hands stilled around his glass. James appeared through a side entrance at exactly the right moment, moving with the quiet authority of someone who has no interest in theater but understands its function perfectly. He stopped a few feet from Harrison and addressed him directly, in a voice pitched for the entire ballroom to hear. He said that he represented Callaway Capital. He said he was drawing attention to a matter involving $5.2 million, transferred from various project budgets to consulting firms that James could not find any legitimate business record for. He said he had transaction records, account registrations, and internal approval chains. All of it. The people standing closest to Harrison began creating distance from him. the way people instinctively move away from something that's beginning to smell wrong. Nobody was looking at Harrison anymore. Everyone was looking at Marcus, or at Natasha, or at each other, trying to reassemble the narrative they thought they had been witnessing into something that made sense with this new information. Marcus turned and walked out of the ballroom without saying another word. Not because he needed to make a dramatic exit, but because everything that needed to happen in that room was already happening without him. He walked out because he had nothing left to prove in there, and he was exhausted from standing in rooms where he had been performing a version of himself that no longer served any purpose. The hallway was quiet, the carpeting thick enough to absorb the sound of the event behind him. He stood near a window looking out over the hotel courtyard, and he allowed himself to actually be still for the first time that entire evening. He heard Natasha's footsteps before he heard her voice. When she came around the corner, she was attempting to reassemble her composure with visible effort. She told him she didn't know, that she swore she had no idea about Harrison's financial activities. She said she never would have gotten involved with him if she had understood what he was actually doing. Marcus looked at her without anger. The anger had burned itself out somewhere during the weeks of waiting, and what was left was something quieter and harder to name. He said that she was correct. He didn't doubt that she was unaware of the specifics of Harrison's theft. But that wasn't the part that mattered. 3 weeks earlier, his security associate had been in an elevator with her and Harrison. She had heard her tell him that Marcus had nothing to hold her, nothing to offer her, nothing that would prevent her from walking away. She had already decided who he was, and she had decided he wasn't worth staying for. The money had never been the variable, she had been. Natasha opened her mouth to respond and then closed it again. Her eyes were bright in the way that precedes tears, and Marcus believed the emotion was genuine. He believed she was sorry, but he also understood that her sorrow, however real it might have been, was not enough to reopen a door that had been closing for a very long time. He turned and walked away from her without looking back. Not to make a statement, but because for the first time in 6 weeks, he had nothing left that required him to wait for anything. Silverwood Estate sat on 14 acres of private land outside the city, a property Marcus had purchased years before he ever met Natasha. He had never mentioned it to her because it existed in a part of his life that had remained deliberately separate. The part that existed before the performance, before the rented apartment and the ordinary suits, before he had learned to make himself smaller than he actually was. Driving there after the gala, he felt the distance between that version of his life and the one he had just left expand with every mile he traveled. He spent the first night alone. He didn't call James. He didn't call anyone. He made coffee at 3 a.m. and sat looking out at the grounds in complete darkness, finding something genuinely comforting in that indifference to everything that had happened, that refusal to acknowledge or react to human drama. James arrived the next morning without being asked. He brought documents and a clear sense of what needed to happen next. But he also brought the understanding that sometimes what people actually need is not immediate action but presence. The simple fact of having someone in the room who understands what you're dealing with and doesn't require you to explain it in detail. Eventually, Marcus said that he had received confirmation that the board wanted to move forward immediately with the fraud investigation. James said yes, he had been ready for weeks. He had simply been waiting for Marcus to reach a point where he wanted this finished. Marcus asked what James thought he should do about all of it, about the marriage and the company situation, and the humiliation that had been performed for an entire room of people. James considered this with the seriousness it deserved, then said that he thought Marcus already knew what he was going to do. He thought Marcus had known since he walked out of that corridor the night before. The fantasy of some orchestrated reversal, some moment where the people who had humiliated him would be made to understand precisely what they had underestimated, had burned itself out somewhere on the drive to the estate. What remained was much simpler and considerably less satisfying. He wanted it to be over, not resolved in some theatrical sense, not avenged or vindicated, just actually over. The board convened an emergency session within days. James presented the complete documentation. 7 transactions across 18 months, each routed through consulting firms that appeared to be legitimate but contained no actual business operations. The audit committee had been quietly reviewing supplementary records since James had first flagged the irregularities, and what they had found corroborated everything. Harrison had been careful, but not careful enough. He had underestimated the thoroughness of the people watching him, which was a characteristic habit of men who had never been held accountable for anything. Harrison was suspended pending investigation and terminated within the week. Civil suits were filed immediately. James also forwarded the complete file to the relevant federal authorities. Within a month, Harrison's accounts had been frozen, and his assets were under review. The Bentley he had been leasing was repossessed. The penthouse he had rented at a monthly rate that would have required most people to save for half a year was listed for sale within 6 weeks. The part Natasha discovered last was that every restaurant reservation Harrison had made, every weekend trip he had taken her on, every small luxury he had used to construct his persona in her eyes, had been paid for with money stolen from the company where she worked. She had been a prop in a con, though not in the way that Harrison had intended. She had been victimized just as much as anyone else. Marcus did not feel satisfaction when he learned this information. He felt something more like sadness, the particular kind that comes from watching someone complete a sequence of mistakes that could have been interrupted at almost any point but never were. Natasha submitted her resignation from the company the week after the gala. She made the right decision, which Marcus respected even from the distance he was maintaining. Making right choices after making catastrophic wrong ones is harder than most people acknowledge. The divorce was handled entirely through attorneys. The process was civil in both the legal and behavioral sense. There were no contested assets, no arguments designed to punish or extract. Marcus had no interest in any of it. What they had in the apartment was furniture and 6 years of a life that no longer existed, and he was willing to leave all of it behind if it meant the paperwork concluded faster. Natasha sent him a letter 3 weeks into the process. It was handwritten, 4 pages, clearly drafted multiple times before she arrived at a version she was satisfied with. She wrote about the moment she realized everything Harrison had shown her had been fabricated. She wrote about the conversation that James had overheard in the elevator. She wrote that she had convinced herself she was being practical, that she was choosing security and ambition over stagnation, but that what she had actually done was choose a performance over a person. The last paragraph said simply that she was sorry, not for being discovered, but for who she had become in the months leading up to her discovery. Marcus read it twice, then folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. He didn't respond because there was nothing left to negotiate between them, and writing back would have suggested otherwise. The Callaway Foundation had been in planning stages for over a year before any of this happened. It was something Marcus had been building quietly, a scholarship and mentorship program for technology students from low-income backgrounds in the area where he had grown up, the kind of pipeline that would have changed the trajectory of several people he had known had it existed when they needed it most. The public launch had been scheduled for spring, and he saw no reason to delay it because his personal life had collapsed. If anything, the timing felt clarifying. There was nothing like watching an entire room of people misread you to remind you that the only version of yourself worth presenting publicly was the one that was actually true. The launch event was held on a Saturday morning in mid-April in a renovated space in the downtown district. It was intentionally stark, exposed brick and simple folding chairs, a microphone that required adjustment. About 150 people were there. City officials, university department heads, journalists, and the first cohort of scholarship recipients who ranged from 17 to 22 and looked simultaneously thrilled and uncertain about what they had walked into. Margaret Cho was seated in the front row. James stood near the back. Marcus found himself standing at the podium wearing an ordinary suit, not as a consultant, not as a background figure, not as a husband performing normalcy. Just Marcus Webb, which was something he had spent a long time treating as a liability and was only now beginning to understand, was simply a fact about who he was. He kept his remarks brief. He had written and discarded 3 longer versions. All of them were too explanatory, too defensive, too focused on context that the audience didn't actually need. What he arrived at was shorter and closer to honest. He said that he had spent a long time believing that the best way to find out what mattered to someone was to let them believe you had nothing. He said that was not wisdom. It was fear wearing the clothes of a strategy. What he had learned was something he should have already known. You cannot build anything real on a withheld foundation. He said that these students weren't there because he had kept anything hidden. They were there because eventually he had stopped. There was applause. He acknowledged it and moved past it as quickly as was appropriate. He saw Natasha near the back of the room when he stepped away from the podium. She was standing slightly apart from everyone else, wearing a coat he didn't recognize, watching the room rather than looking at him, though she knew he had seen her. She didn't approach. She didn't raise a hand in greeting. She simply stood there, watching the scholarship recipients receive their certificates, watching James laugh at something Margaret had said, watching a version of a world that she had walked out of and could not walk back into. Then she turned and moved toward the exit unhurried, without looking back. Marcus watched her go. He did not feel the anger he might have expected, or the grief, or the particular tightness in the chest that had accompanied so many ordinary moments over the previous several months. What he felt was something closer to clarity, the specific quiet kind that comes after a long confusion finally resolves into something simple and inevitable. She had made her choices. He had made his. The consequences of both were now fully in motion, moving forward without requiring anything further from either of them. One of the scholarship recipients, a 19-year-old named Devon, who wanted to build community technology infrastructure, came up to him after the formal program ended and shook his hand. Devon said he had applied to the program 3 times before it officially launched, submitting materials to the Foundation's preliminary intake form without knowing whether anything would come of it. He said he almost hadn't submitted the 3rd time. Marcus told him he was genuinely glad he had. Walking out of that building into the April morning with the sun already high enough to be warm, Marcus thought about the version of himself that had stood in that hotel corridor 4 months earlier, tired and clear-eyed, walking away from a room that had just finished performing its verdict on who he was. That version of him had made the right decision. He just hadn't known yet what he was walking toward. Sometimes you don't know that part until you're already there. The road was quiet, driving back toward the estate, and the morning was genuinely good in a way that didn't require qualification or analysis. If you found yourself thinking about the way we judge people, about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore, then this story did what it was supposed to do. The people who humiliated Marcus that night weren't villains in some movie sense. They were just people who had decided without much thought that a quiet man in an ordinary suit had nothing worth respecting. That assumption cost them everything. And the lesson isn't that you should hide who you are until you find the right moment to reveal it. The real lesson is simpler. How you treat someone who appears to have nothing says everything about who you actually are. If stories about dignity, about patience, about the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience, matter to you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you in the next one.